I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're diving into a powerful book. It is called Against All Odds, A Desperate Plea for Human Connection. It's written by a terrific author by the name of Dr. Carola Hauer. This powerful book bridges the gap between survivors of complex trauma and the service community, emphasizing the need for compassion and understanding. We're delighted to have this very talented author join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support authors like her by subscribing to our channel and by purchasing her amazing book. The links are below the interview. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you so much.
Tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind writing Against All Odds.
The inspiration comes from a number of sources. So first of all, I personally am a survivor, and I have had a long journey of coming to the place where I am now, which means a much more peaceful place and a place with like a lot of opportunities and less limitations due to the long-term consequences of adverse childhood experiences or complex trauma. The other part is that I have been working on the front line. I worked in the hospital for 10 years in all departments, emergency room, medical floor, the mental health unit. And I've met with like so many people who I spoke to and who have told me not only about the trauma, which in the beginning they're usually very hesitant, but about the struggles post-trauma. And people ranging all ages. I had somebody, a lot of times I would be called on the floor because somebody was so desperate and had a suicide attempt. And, it could be an 84-year-old lady who puts her hand on my arm and says, honey, can I talk to you for a moment? And I was like, of course. And I would close the door, and then they would tell me about their childhood trauma, which is still haunting them. And a lot of times for many people, and also in that age group, it wasn't something that you would take to therapy, and they would just bury it. A lot of times they would get married and have children. And when the children have grown up and they're like in the later stages of life, those memories and those behaviors that they have developed in defense of the trauma are haunting them. And this wonderful lady, she was a teacher, and she said to me, she said, I don't even know why I'm here anymore. And I said, you know what am I going to do without the elders? And she looked at me and she says, well, is that really important? I said, yeah, it's important. And she says, well, I'm talking about it now. I'm 84. And I said, you know what? It doesn't matter when you talk about it. It matters that you can start speaking about it. And obviously, we don't want people to have to wait that long. So I've had young kids in the emergency room who went through horrible trauma, childhood trauma. I had young parents. And in the course of my work, I saw a lot of people struggling. And the cause was mostly that they had a very, very difficult start. Even people who were struggling with like addiction, many people who come to the ER are struggling with addiction. And instead of being judgmental of it or casting them aside or saying, well, they have done this for the last 28 years. One gentleman, I just asked him and I said, well, what happened 28 years ago? And he looks at me and he said, do you really want to know? Like, yeah, I really want to know. And he cried and he said, nobody has asked me for that. And I'm like, I can't imagine that. And he told me he had lost his fiance who was like diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and he lost her within 6 weeks. So he was like kind of stamped as the alcoholic who has thrown his life away for 28 years. Underneath that, he had some complex trauma. Complex trauma leads a lot of times to addiction. And so I think we need to hear the story, and I think we need to pay attention to that. And that's what survivors need.
Yeah. When you talk about trauma, it's kind of broad. Let's talk about what the spectrum includes: physical, verbal, sexual. Is that man's case, the emotional trauma of losing a loved one, also considered a trauma?
Well, if it happens between zero, it's always considered a trauma.
Yeah.
Because that's specific. But when you talk about childhood abuse, a lot of people talk about physical, sexual, and emotional abuse.
Right.
But in the ACEs study, which I am actually, so ACEs is an acronym which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences.
Right.
And in that study in the 90s, mid 90s, late 90s, when it was published, they came up with like 10 criteria for that. And so it's beyond those three well-known abuses. It's emotional abuse, it's physical abuse.
Right.
It's domestic violence in your family. It's somebody with mental health, suffering from mental health in your family. It's somebody who, well, substance abuse in your family. It's divorce or loss of a parent. And it is also incarceration. So there's actually 10 criteria, and now we can at least have that a little bit as a landmark, and we can say, let me just ask you about this. And then I ask them about those 10 items, and I can just see there's just a nod and a nod and a nod, and a lot of people have 4 or 6 or 7 or 8, and some of us have 10.
Right.
Some of them have experienced all of it. Now, it doesn't account for the depth of or the frequency of the occurrences or but it gives us kind of a marker that we can start a conversation. And I would love to just say, I just met somebody for a consult just yesterday, and I just kind of like just ran down that list and talked a little bit about long-term consequences, and the tears are flowing and the person is nodding. This is important information because survivors of that type of trauma don't need to feel that they're crazy, that they're lost, that they're alone, that they're on an island and nobody believes them. No, you're absolutely right. Trauma is a very, very broad category. I had somebody come into the ER and I just could not find anything in their background that was giving me like any idea what they had been experiencing. And I asked the person if he had any trauma. And he said, no, not really. And I got to the part, it's like, okay, how are we going to get you home? I said, well, that's a problem. I'm like, well, tell me about it. And he says, well, I used to have a lot of family here and nobody is left. I'm like, what do you mean by that? He said, well, they all died. And then he listed like father, mother, sister, aunt, cousin. And I took a breath and I said, just tell me the time frame. He goes, well, I think it was maybe in the last year and a half. I said, I'm like, I am so sorry. Number one, you had all these losses. And I want you to know he had come in with a substance abuse issue, which hadn't been a long-term thing. It was a reaction to his trauma, and made a fool of himself while he was drunk. And he was ashamed. And I said, if I had 9 people in my close family die within a year and a half, I don't know what I would do. I'm not suggesting we're drinking or we're using drugs or anything, but that's huge. And he says, well, I thought everybody has to deal with that. And I said, no, people usually don't have to deal with that. It was 9 people in his close family, and he was the only one in the vicinity.
It's interesting when people live in such a nightmarish situation, they assume that's normal in some ways, that everybody goes through it. Those 10 traumas you mentioned, they also tend to fuel each other. Somebody is a substance abuser, so they abuse their spouse, they sexually abuse their children, they wind up incarcerated, there's domestic violence in the house, there's divorce. I mean, on and on and on. So we talk about the cycle of abuse. First, it starts, like I said, often with mental health issues or substance abuse, and then it fuels all of the others. And then what happens to that child? In many cases, they grow up to abuse alcohol, abuse their spouse, sexually abuse others, right?
If you take a look at the statistics, actually, and you see when somebody has to, we're calling these the 10 ACEs right now. Right. And so if you have 4 ACEs, you are like 4 times more likely to be depressed and 12 times more likely to be suicidal at one point in your life. If you go to 6, you're much more likely to actually use IV drug use. And if you go to 10, you can just kind of exponentially look at that. Here's why I'm writing this. What I want is, I also write about parenting. So here we come from a background like that. Also, not to forget generational patterns, which kind of lead into that. And it's kind of like handed down through generations and generations and generations. But parenting, for example, I have two daughters. Parenting is so difficult because you don't understand what you're going through. You're still going through all the chaos of that. And then you try to raise a child. And so the way you raise a child is you overcompensate by doing everything opposite to what was done to you. But it doesn't always work. Now, if we could regulate strong emotions, if we could be in healthy relationships, and even one of the most important things is you don't get to attach to a healthy family system. So you don't know how to attach to other people.
Right.
And you don't understand exactly what to do with the attachment of your own kids. I mean, you don't want them to experience any of the things that you have experienced. And then vicariously, you do hand down some trauma to them, which is like the most disheartening thing. And I want people to know that that is unfortunately part of it, but that we can actually, Dr. Gawamata is one of my favorite people to talk about this. He says, don't be so dismayed. Correct what you can correct at the time when you can correct it. And so the best thing we can do if we have issues like that, number one, get yourself into therapy. The second one is apply the tools that you're getting when you're working with your children. But then there's another problem. Same-sex children pull on your own traumatic issues much more than opposite-sex children. So if you have boys as a woman, you're not struggling that much. But if you have girls, you see yourself at all these ages. So therapy, education, and the knowledge that, yes, unfortunately, generational patterns don't just stop with us because we want to stop them. We have to have the tools to work towards it. And it may take more than my generation. It may take the next generation, but at least there's an awareness. And at least we're going to hand down some tools. And at least we can make changes now. And that's so healing and helpful that you know that you're not just doomed to be different.
Yeah. I also think it's interesting that, two people can grow up in the same family, subjected to the same abuse, and have completely different outcomes. And I guess that pertains to the vulnerability of each individual. Some people might just be a very sensitive person and easily quashed, and the other person might have more fortitude, if you will, right?
Absolutely. And that's why, for example, the ACEs are not a predictor what type of trauma you're going to develop. That's a really important point. The other thing is that a lot of times in families where unfortunately there's a lot of harsh, aggressive, and sometimes abusive treatment, individuals can be singled out. Yes. Many times I hear, I was the oldest one, and I was actually told by my father that I reminded him of my mother. So then when I was like 6 years old, I got taken in and I got the same treatment. And the other ones are just not as much of a trigger. So it depends on so many variables. But you know what? Most important, there's so many important messages for me. But one of the most important is, number one, we did not volunteer for that. We did not ask for that. So it's not that we need to walk around and think that we're bad people because this came our way. Just really important. And then to the outside world, I'm also talking to the families that are dealing with us every day and don't exactly know how to deal with it, right? It's like we need understanding and support. That doesn't mean we can do whatever we want to do, but when I think about people who are dealing with substance abuse, families are so disheartened when the survivor reaches back to the old behavior, to the default. But then it's like, okay, then we have to just assess and say, was it as bad this time as it was last time? You have already managed for 9 months, get back on the wagon and keep going. And to learn that, let's say, as a survivor, I mean, I'm just a representative of many survivors. Yeah, we have sometimes traumatic reactions because things come our way that we just don't know how to deal with. A lot of things seem like life and death, which are experience for other people. They say, well, yeah, the boss wasn't very nice, but you know what? I'm not going to take that home. But for somebody who has been beaten down and been told that they're a bad person and that they're stupid and that they're this and that and whatever, and nobody cares about them, it may just feel like, you know, the ground was pulled from underneath you. And so we may have like a more heavier reaction to that. And it's like, whoa, okay. How can people help us best? By giving us a moment and just be compassionate and just give us a moment to get the insight lined up again and worked out and regulated so that we can then respond to the outside.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm asking for. That's trauma-informed care.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely, absolutely. Amazing all that you unpack there, particularly the fact that one child is often the magnet for the abuse. And it often is because the child resembles the spouse of the abuser. And that's horrid. You know, it's like you said, a trauma that has to be dealt with a professional like yourself. Let's talk a little bit about your book. What will folks find when they crack open the covers? How will it help them? How will it guide them to understanding this issue of trauma better?
What I tried to do, I thought to myself, number one, I know as a psychologist working with tons of people that narratives are always strong evidence. So if I tell a family who comes to the hospital and one of their loved ones is in a bad situation or has tried to kill themselves, I'm going to try to get them to understand that person's viewpoint and narrative before they even meet them. So narrative is important. Narrative is important. Evidence is important. Education is important. What I wanted to do with the book, number one, I do not want to overwhelm anybody. We're talking about some heavy subjects, but I'm always keeping in mind, we do not want to overwhelm the survivor or the people who are willing to support us. So I give enough information, I think, but I'm trying to, and that's just my attitude towards this whole topic. To me, there's hope. I am living hope. People have told me this many times. I got through a lot and I'm here and I have been able to get, you know, to a better life. And a lot of people can get there with the right help. So what I did, I designed it in a way, kind of intuitively. I told my story, then I gave two like life events that show you actually how survivors of a harsh past are being mistreated in society. Like say in a medical event, I use accent, I use a medical event where everything that came my way and I was actually punished for having a harsh history. And then I'm talking about the topic of suicide, and I'm talking about a couple of narratives that I was part of and that I could help with, that are giving a little bit of insight because people need to understand. I don't want anybody to kill themselves, and I'm fighting hard to avoid that and help people as much as I can. But when somebody is in this like narrow tunnel of their vision and think that that little flame of hope that they had is extinguished, they're not thinking about the kids, the dogs, the job, whatever. They're in a really difficult place. Now, if somebody is in that place and they're reaching out to family members, to friends, the best we can do is listen. And then the best we can do is actually, so Brene Brown actually in the Atlas of the Heart, like defines empathy and compassion really, really, really well. One of the most important things is believe the person what they're telling you. That is their story. Now, if it is completely unrealistic and psychotic, then we're still going to keep that like space where we're supporting the person, right? And we're probably not going to argue with them. Most people who are like on the edge, if somebody will believe them, hear them, not take on the pain. Nobody has to walk in our pain. We don't want pity. We don't want anybody to carry what we have already carried, but just allow us to be human. Yeah. And that's why I say a desperate need for human connection is like, allow us to be heard and just maybe say the things we need to say. And then there will actually almost always be a moment when we have that connection where we can actually talk. But they don't need to be judged. They don't need to be criticized. We don't need to penalize anybody. We don't need to tell them that they're making our life 10 times worse. Just hear the person. And if somebody in that darkness sees that they're being understood, it just changes everything.
And just letting it out eases a huge burden for that person.
Yes.
Because they've been harboring this deep secret. Now they're telling another person, they're viewing it perhaps as an adult. They realize they were a victim as a child and they're not responsible for any of it. And that's when they break through.
And we just hear them.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
while you're doing that, you can actually get yourself back together. So then in the book, I'm using 9 chapters. They all came together somehow. And in the next edit will probably be a little bit more in addition to that, explaining trauma, what happens on the inside, what happens to the traumatic brain, just brief chapters. They're at the most like 4 or 5 pages. I'm not writing a novel. I'm not writing a dissertation. I just want to say, listen, so many people were told to snap out of it, but our brain has changed. The way we store memory and retrieve memory has changed. The way we look at the world, the way we don't feel safe in the world, we just don't snap out of that. We have to understand it. Then we have to get insight. Then we have to have awareness of what's happening to us. And then we can begin to make changes. So I put those 9 educational chapters in there for everybody because they're so important. And I try to synthesize. I try to get the information and make it like hands-on and practical. Like if my traumatic brain is in gear, I cannot use all my fancy gray matter to make all these fancy judgments and executive decisions and keep time and be oriented. And you just don't. You're just in your anxious brain. And that's what I have to calm down in order to get my functioning back. I put all that in place before I share. I have 9 narratives in the book of people who gave me permission to tell their story, who I have met in all sorts of different ways. And they're so different that I try to describe all the different types of trauma that they encountered. And I'm encouraging the reader to please just honor the stories. They're not to be torn apart and discussed, and this is right, and that's right, and this is true, and that's not true. That's not what it's about. Those participants who I absolutely cherish gave me permission to share the stories just for that, so that people can relate. Because wait a minute, I had that, and this is how the person reacted. So we have a little bit of something to get our life like back on track or on track for the first time ever. Yeah. I'm also talking then about, so in the last chapters, I'm talking about how we go into this like underworld experience of re-experiencing all these things and how we put the pieces back together. How helpful it is for us to have guides, to people believe in us, people can support us. And that the journey to come back is not the easiest journey. But it's possible. Yeah. And the more help, I mean, I appreciate you paying attention to the topic because that's what we have to do. And if adverse childhood experiences would be a thing of the past, I'd be happy. But they're not. They're
Absolutely.
ongoing. Yeah. They're ongoing. And one quick comment.
Sure.
Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is phenomenal, as a researcher, as a clinician, and as a guide in trauma recovery, he said in his book and in his seminars, he said that trauma survivors who haven't had any treatment yet really truly live on a different universe. And I find that so valid. You live in a different world. You see that other people are reacting different. They see that they're not struggling like you're struggling. They don't have the same reactions, but you'll know how to get there. Yeah. So understanding, compassion, and information really is, and support. It goes a long way.
It's amazing. It's amazing. I think everybody either has some ACEs know somebody who has ACs. I mean, it's too prevalent in our society, from divorce, substance abuse, which of course, as we discussed before, leads to physical abuse or sexual abuse. So everybody, if it's not you, everybody knows somebody who's suffering in this way. So this
Yes.
book is truly enlightening. This conversation has been truly enlightening. I learned a lot myself today, so hopefully our viewers will too. The name of the book is Against All Odds, A Desperate Plea for Human Connection. It is a powerful book that bridges a gap between survivors of complex trauma and the service community. It emphasizes the need for compassion and understanding. This has been a great interview. This is a great book. Buy it for yourself, buy it for somebody who needs it. There's likely somebody in your life who has gone through an adverse childhood experience. One, two, three, perhaps all 10. It's amazing. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
I appreciate you a lot. Thank you so much.
I appreciate your time, Doctor. To the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time, this time until next time on Spotlight.